Well, everyone, let me welcome Dr. Laurine Albris, who is at the National Museum of Denmark right now, and
Mhm.
who has a special interest in the intersection of archaeology and onomastics, the study of place names. So, uh, why don't you tell us a little bit about how that interest is, what you're exploring that interest right now?
Yeah, I've studied archaeology at the University of Copenhagen and also had some studies at the University of Sheffield, for instance, while I was doing my master's. And I was kind of always searching for something extra for archaeology. And I am an archaeologist, but I was always interested in combining it with other things. And when you work with Viking Age and Iron Age Scandinavia, it's natural to be interested in written sources and linguistic sources. But it's also very difficult because, as you talk about often on your show, that the ways we use the written sources, it's sometimes difficult to combine it with archaeology. And well, not so many archaeologists really use place names or personal names for that matter. Um, Very much. There's been a sort of skepticism. This has actually become a little bit better here in later years, but when I started looking into this, at least at my university, they were very skeptical towards
Hmm.
it. It was a little bit better in Aarhus and also in Sweden. They've had a stronger tradition for being interested in this kind of combination. Um, but that also means that there's a kind of area where I can make a contribution by I've been delving into both areas and being able to translate between these disciplines to archaeologists from onomastics and the other way around. Um, and then I've worked with for my PhD, and if you want, I have a small presentation that I can show you some slides from. I worked with some of these central places, as we call them, that are these large, rich sites with halls that kind of laid the foundation for the Iron Viking Age society as it evolved through the first millennium AD. And some of these have some interesting place name material as well. And there are theories in onomastics about how place names relate to the way of organizing society, but how do these things fit together in terms of chronology and in terms of whether, do you have an interesting place name? Is there any archaeology there?
Hmm.
Uh, or the other way around? And I think often archaeologists get disappointed. They expect special place names to be in a place where there are special finds, and again, the other way around. But what I've thought in later years is sometimes when there's a new find or a new site, um, I think, well, I'm not that surprised that that came up at this place because it has an interesting place name. So the more we get, archaeology is moving forward because there are excavations all the time, because of construction work, basically, and also, of course, in these later decades, metal detecting has exploded, especially in Denmark. Uh, Norway is getting into it as well. In England, of course, it's also very big. And then in Sweden, it's not allowed to metal detect for ordinary people who are not archaeologists and don't have a permission. So there's a kind of imbalance there now because in Denmark we have all these finds coming in, and that means that new sites are appearing and more sites than we had ever imagined possible, actually. So this is also making place names more relevant again, I would say.
Have
So
place
it's a
names?
very interesting time.
I don't mean to
Yeah.
interrupt you. Have place names been used to identify potential spots to excavate? This place is called something cool. Let's dig and see if there's a reason.
Not as much as I would have liked to happen. And that's because it's not always easy to just, get the money to just go and excavate at a place when it has an interesting name. But there is one place in Western Zealand where there were some metal detecting amateur archaeologists who I had known for some years. They were very active at the site called Tisø, and which is, by the way, a sacred place name, but we might talk about that later. And they asked, is there anywhere you would recommend that we go to try to find a new site? And I said, there's this place called Herslev, and it's a combination of the word Hayas, warrior, and a very interesting generic leo, which is it means something left over, and it's a very mysterious type of place name, but it's Iron Age, just pre-Viking, um, and we think it has something to do with um, division of land rights.
Like in
So
Vindaloo.
yeah, like Vinaloo, yeah. So there are more of these, and they might be related to, yeah, property in some way. So they went out there and they found some very interesting things, and now it's a place where things are being published from, but they weren't from the period that I expected. They were more like late Viking Age, medieval, and I had hoped something would come up from maybe the fifth, sixth centuries, but it might be there. There's a gold ring from the Roman Iron Age in that area, but so maybe they've just not bumped into that place or those finds yet. But yeah, we never know. And of course, I think also in the one very large central place and kind of a locus classicus is the one called Gulme on the island of Fyn. And well, I can't really say if it's the place name or if it's the archaeology, because in that area, gold finds have always been coming out of the ground. And it also has this name, Gudme, which means Gudheim, the home of the gods. Um, so obviously, there's something special about this place. Um, but when excavations began, it was also in connection with construction work. So often an excavation will start because there's some kind of threat to the archaeology at the spot,
Mhm.
not because archaeologists just want to dig in an interesting place, unfortunately.
Yeah, the builders
Yeah.
have the money to break the ground, and then if the broken ground has something interesting, then archaeologists get to take a look at it.
Yeah, well, then there's by law some kind of complicated rules about the building. Well, they have to pay for some archaeology, and also just for looking to see if there is anything that will be threatened if it's in an interesting area. And then if it becomes very expensive, they're giving the opportunity to kind of move the construction to a better location in terms of then we just keep the archaeology in the ground. Uh, because yeah, ideally we would actually just like to let it stay in the ground, because it will be destroyed when we excavate it, of course.
Mhm.
But we learn a lot um, of course, the Iron and Viking ages from the archaeology. I also have to say that there was one site that was excavated um solely on research ground. I think it was maybe threatened by cultivation because plowing and agriculture also destroys the sites very heavily, actually. And that is Tisø, which is by this large lake on Western Zealand. And the name of the lake it means the lake of Tyr, the god Tyr. Um, and again, here there were not as many finds as in Gudme, but when in 1977, a very large gold ring, like large enough to kind of hang around the neck of a horse, came out by plowing. And they started becoming aware of this area. Actually, it turned out a lot of swords had been coming out of the lake through the years, and there were also some different types of finds all over. So they started actually doing some very large research excavations in this area. And this was also helped by these detector guys I talked about who later went to Herslev. So this place was, yeah, it was a combination of the place name and the finds and the want to look into something. And what happened at this place was kind of unexpectedly. This was the first place where they uncovered the whole complex of a hall with surrounding fences and houses and little pit houses for workshops. And there was, because it was easy to remove the topsoil, in many of the places we have many layers of what we call cultural layers that are full of all this material. So it takes a long time to dig through it. But here we could take off the topsoil. I say we because I was actually there when I was still a school student. That was my first excavation. And I also came back later when I was a PhD student. So that's a very interesting site.
And that place name has been on the radar of scholars for a long time, even before there were excavations. I remember one of the first books I ever read in the secondary literature on the mythology was Terville Peters' um, Myth and Religion of the North, something like that, from the 50s or 60s. And he points to that as just, this is a very interesting place name. Perhaps there's something here, and doesn't know if there's anything there. Uh, so it's cool that decades later, something actually did come out of there.
Yes, and then the big question is how do these things relate to each other?
Um,
There is this lake, and it's probably some kind of sacral or holy lake. They did throw swords into it. One sword is from the Celtic Iron Age. It's a Latin type sword, so it's very early. And then most of them are more like Viking Age, later Viking Age. But there are also some finds from up through the years, and there are these bone spears from also the early Iron Age. So it seems like the lake has been used for throwing in weapons for the whole of the first millennium. But it's not like these sacrificial bogs that we also have in Scandinavia, where that was particularly in the Roman Iron Age, where they threw in a lot of weapons at the same time, seemingly the kind of booty of a battle, or we don't know, of course, if it was the winning part or the losing part, or who actually threw that material in. But they did come back to the same places and to do this. But in Tissø, it's more like one find or one weapon at a time, and in different places in the lake. So I think this lake had a special meaning, and kept that meaning through all these centuries.
right.
Um,
That's
yeah.
isn't that one of the most fascinating aspects of this? Because you're not talking about one static culture or people through all those centuries. You have at a minimum Celtic and then Germanic speakers and probably West Germanic and North Germanic speakers. And yet this place remains special. It please correct me if I'm wrong. The Roman Iron Age weapon deposits, very often the weapons are kind of destroyed, right? They twist them or something.
Yes, they would often they twist them. You can see that they are smashed, and deliberately all these things have been done to them with axes, and yeah, they've been sometimes bundled together, but they're just completely destroyed. They were not able to use them after this. And we do have this in bogs, but it's not only in bogs. We also find it, for example, at some of the settlements. Um, it's not as clear in Gudme, but at another contemporary large settlement, Sortemul, there are these weapon deposits, and very clearly at the site called Uppåkra in Scania in southern Sweden, there's some large weapon deposits, and it seems like they're doing the same kinds of things to the weapons at in both the bogs and at the settlements. But I don't think the Tissø finds actually were destroyed in the same way, and that's interesting.
Hmm.
I haven't really been thinking about that. That might be something to look into. But it's frustrating with Tissø. We think there might be more there, but it's difficult to actually find where the deposits in the lake are. That has to do with the just the sediments in the lake. So we have tried, but not succeeded yet.
Hmm. And this may be anticipating something you wanted to present on with Tisa or other names, but just a question of
Mhm.
curiosity that flitted across my mind. Do you find that places named for particular named figures cluster together? Is Tisa close to other things named for Tyr?
No, not particularly. On Zealand, we have a couple of names in the north that are called Tisvilde, which is like the springs or sources of Tyr, and Tibirke, but that is not. That is the weird thing about Tyr, the god, of course, is that his name also means God.
Right.
Uh, yeah, so we can't really know if it's meant to be him,
Hmm.
this deity, or if it's if they're referring to just God or gods. Um, but in the case of Tibirke, it's definitely plural. So it's there they mean gods. And we also have this word or name in some names in Jutland. So
Hmm.
it's kind of uh, spread around Denmark. But the odd thing is that it's actually mostly in Denmark. There's one place in Norway with this deity, but apart from that, the rest of Scandinavia don't have place names with Tyr.
Hmm.
Um, so here we have a kind of regionality, probably. And I'm asking myself whether that has to do with some chronology. I've been thinking a lot about whether the lake name is a very old name and deriving back from when this early salt was deposited, because we have discussions of whether Tyr was an older god, of course, so it's potentially very old, or whether it's relating to when they started having this very large hall site, and that was founded in the middle of the 6th century. So was the lake already a sacral lake with a sacral name, and that's why they chose to put their hall at this spot next to the lake.
Hmm.
That's kind of what I'm leaning towards, but it's we can't know, of course.
Right. It's so interesting, and you know, one there's so many different directions you can speculate with it. Like,
Mhm.
is this does this come from a time when Tivar is a common term for the gods, which it might well have been
Mhm.
at some point? And is this translating even a Celtic name that means something like God Lake or what have you, right? You can't
Yeah.
know it, but huh, yeah.
That's what also makes it really fascinating. In the beginning, I was more skeptical, but the more I work with this, the more open I am to the kind of wilder interpretations. I think maybe because it's just it seems that, there is a kind of pattern, um, or at least, things keep coming up at these places with sacral names or, um, yeah, the area in Northern Zealand, Tibirke and Tisvilde. It's also very interesting, but I don't really know yet what we can get from that. But it's a place, an area where I think things will start emerging, and they might also be a bit earlier. Um, so yeah.
And is there something is this lake really noticeable or scenic or something like that? But part of why I'm wondering about this, I've been thinking a little bit in anticipation of talking to you about place names and people's
Mhm.
relationship with places. And a few weeks ago, we were walking around with a friend on his ranch where he has a lot of Apache artifacts. And there's a lot of places where these artifacts cluster, and it's often where the view is really good. And he says, you know, I think they enjoyed the same views we enjoyed
Mhm.
a few hundred years ago when they would camp out here, and that's why we find, you know, this and that. Is there anything to that? Is it like is it a particularly scenic or beautiful or useful landscape?
It's an incredible landscape. Of course, Zealand is flat if you are, there has hills, and there are some hills around this lake, but it's a very large lake, and it has this very nice kind of round shape. and it's low. Water levels are low until a certain point. It has a spectacular bird life, and so it's today it's a bird reservation, and people come there just for the to take walks for the nature. So it is a wonderful place, and they put this hall site on this little kind of almost island that was almost going into the lake. So they were very, very close to the lake. So yeah, I'm sure that these spectacular places in the landscape also meant a lot in prehistory and early history. There's another place where there is one of these central places called Boslunde, and it has this very weird, kind of magnificent, protruding hill that this whole site is kind of arranged around.
Hmm.
And it's very much a feature of the landscape that you really can't get around. Today, it's been part of it has been destroyed because later on there was gravel extraction and all these things. So some of the more monumental aspects of the landscape are not as monumental today, but we can see that they kind of choose these places. With a lake, why did they choose the lake? Well, people today also like to live near lakes. We like
Yeah.
to look at water. And of course, if you feel that it's a special lake with a deity that might protect you or uh, do something good to you. Um, but these other sites, I think the prominent hills maybe have something to do with also that they're good to use for standing on and speaking.
Mhm.
So we see also in some of the Swedish central sites that they have these also sometimes human-built mounds uh, that they use for speaking out. Uh, so they also use the landscape, um, and
Makes perfect
sometimes they
sense.
even enhance it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they were looking at it with the same sort of eyes as we are.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
just think that's a neat continuity, and it makes me
Hmm.
wonder about a place like Odense, where you have such
Hmm.
a cool, but Odin's sacred place, and of course now it's a major city. Uh, I guess people are settling probably for similar reasons around there, right? I actually haven't ever
Um,
been.
yeah. There's been some efforts to reconstruct the landscape in Odense because one of these ring forts that were built by Harold Bluetooth is also there. Um, and I think that these hill forts or no ring forts were put in places that were already special
Mhm.
and probably also places that had something to do with religion. So we of course have Odense, which is Odin's V, where V is uh, a word that means holy or sacred and a holy or sacred site. And of course, it's then the sacred site of Odin, but also the one called Trelleborg. There is a site before Trelleborg where there's these sacrificial wells with both animals and humans, and even some children in these wells.
Hmm.
So it must have been a sort of cult site before they built Trelleborg. And also in northern Jutland, the place called Fyrkat is also very close to another Odin place name. So they might be kind of imposing on the former sacred landscape with these ring forts.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, I mean, I suppose in Sweden you have something like that with Uppsala, with a sacred site in the Iron Age and the Viking Age becoming a major city in the Middle Ages as well, and into the modern period. That's
Yes.
yeah. We tend to inhabit a lot of the same places. That
Mm.
makes perfect sense to me. Well, could
But
we
then
look?
sometimes they also move the sites. So, for example, at Lejre, um, already in medieval times, there was kind of nothing there. It was even described as a kind of nothing place, but they knew that it was a former center of the Kingdom of Denmark. But they moved the center to Roskilde, which is nearby, and in the bottom of the fjord with a harbor. But the site itself, it even didn't even get a church. So it was the local neighbor village that got the local church. So they kind of just left the site or forgot about its former glory, in a way.
Well, that's like here when the railroad comes through, the railroad town grows and the formerly big town shrinks, or the interstate comes through and the interstate town grows. Yeah, I guess
Yeah, so
that's
the
what's gonna
question is
happen.
whether it was deliberate because it was a former heathen center and they wanted to
Yeah,
kind of get away from that, or if it had just had to do with the practicalities of a new era and they needed just the site to be in another kind of location at this
yeah.
point. Um, but it probably also has to do with some shifts in royal power. And they built this very magnificent um, church in Roskilde, which is still there basically. So where all the kings are buried now. Um, yeah.
And I saw a question in the chat from Chaba who asked if there were examples of place names that appear to have been changed after the conversion.
Um, there must be, but sometimes, of course, it's hard to say because most of the place names were written down after the conversion.
Sure.
So what was there that wasn't preserved is actually hard to say. But what is actually strange is that they kept a name like Odense,
Yeah.
because we've seen other places in, for example, Germany, that they mo made more efforts to clean out these ancient heathen place names, that they wanted to get rid of those. But apparently that was not seen as a problem in Denmark and Sweden and Norway. Um, they kept these old names, but
That is interesting.
some might have disappeared. Yeah.
Well, I almost wonder if that lines up a little bit with the way that the names of the days of the week are replaced somewhat in Germany, but not in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. You have with the gods and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Um, but I guess in Iceland, they're all replaced in the days of the week, but you still have a lot of gods and place names in Iceland. At least Thor is in a bunch of places.
Yeah. Well, the days of the week, of course, also is a discussion because it's yeah, also in English as well, it's discussed when did this translation happen?
Yeah.
Was it before or after Christianity? There are different opinions on that. Um,
Uh-huh.
yeah,
I have, I mean, I have my doubts about it being as super ancient as people sometimes claim it is, particularly since the Old Norse names actually look like they're borrowed from a West Germanic language, right? But
exactly. Yeah.
that's a whole,
So
that's
that's
a
a
can of worms.
complicated decision. Or yeah, discussion. Yeah, should we answer, you usually answer questions afterwards, or do you just do it as they come?
Well, the only other one I saw, and I think you covered it, was Blake asked, I believe some Viking
Yeah.
Age were destroyed when they were deposited or
Yeah.
buried as well. So since you covered that, I hadn't turned it up. Could
Yeah.
Yeah, usually I just I'll ask them at moments where there's a pause or where it's relevant to what you're talking about. Could we see some of the presentation you mentioned? That sounds
Yeah.
quite interesting. You are
So
co-host.
it will repeat some of the things I already talked about, but it's nice to see some images. Good. Do you get should I just,
I see it. Central places and
yeah,
sacrifices.
yeah, I'll just see how I don't remember how to start the presentation when it's in this kind of mode. Maybe it's just like
I do not remember either.
this. Yeah,
There you go.
is it? Yeah, now?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so this is actually Tisø, the banks of Lake Tisø, where the excavation is being done in the 90s. So you can see behind that the sea. So there's the small river runs through Tisø and into the sea. They probably couldn't sail. We always discuss whether they could sail up these, but the Danish rivers are all very small. So they couldn't sail in there with large Viking ships, but they could probably land with Viking ships out in the sea and then transport in to this site. by the lake. And this is where the Viking Age and late Iron Age halls were situated. Yes, so this is just to set an atmosphere for what is it actually we're looking at. Mounds and standing stones, and I have this site next to a church on Bornholm, which is also an Iron Age central site. But sometimes they're next to churches, and sometimes they kind of shy away from churches. So there's not really a pattern there. Um, the little water hole we have here in the corner is from a place on Bornholm where they sacrificed these little gold foil figurines. Um, and today it's still a water hole. Um, this is a map that I keep going back to by John Korsgaard Sørensen from 1992, and he's mapped all the place names that he believed were, legitimate sacred place names in southern Scandinavia. And what we see is that there are some different types of sacred place names. We have the gods represented, and it's mainly gods like Tyr, Odin, and Thor and Frey. There aren't many others. And then we also have these words for cult places. We have V that we talked about before, and then there are others that are more difficult to interpret. We have a word called hag or herg, which means something with stones, maybe a pile of stones or even maybe a stone altar. I have to say that Elder Heide has just written a new book interpreting the word hog in a completely different way. He thinks that it's something with passing through barriers. I haven't read the book yet, so I haven't formed an opinion about his opinion yet, but it might be interesting. So I would recommend if you're interested in sacred place names in general in Scandinavia that you find the article by Stefan Brink that is called "How Uniform Was the Old Norse Religion," because it gives an image of all the place names and their kind of regional differences throughout Scandinavia, and he has some nice maps. It's available online, so you can just find it if you want to delve into all this. Um, yeah. So you can see we have all these place names and they're spread out. But then we also have these excavated known sites from archaeology that we call central places. And I have to say that the term central place has been watered out a bit because originally, when the first sites were found, we thought that there were very few, and uh, and we thought that they were kind of the central places where everything happened. But as more material is coming in, we're beginning to question whether there were actually more of such places and who were they central to and what role did they even play in the landscape. But some are definitely larger and more important than others. And we have this division between the early sites and the later sites. The early sites begin in the already in the Roman Iron Age, so they begin to really blossom in the third century. And there are very few of those. So we have Gudme on Fyn and Sortemul on Bornholm, and a place like Helgö in Sweden. Um, and of and then there's Hove up here in Norway, and Avaldsnes, and both Hove has a place name that means something like it's it had the basic meaning is actually a hill, but the meaning came to be a hall or an important house. Um, and Gudme, of course, is home of the gods, and Helgö means the holy island. So we have these sites that are related to sacred place names. And then something happens in the middle of the 6th century where a lot of new places emerge. For example, Tisø that we talked about and Leira. And we have actually more of these sites are coming up. There are some that aren't even on this map. Um, but at that point, particularly Gudme is kind of ebbing out. So some kind of shift is happening, and we're still finding out what that is. It might have to do with there are new DNA studies that show that there's a new group that is coming in, or maybe actually a group that has been out and coming back with a new kind of DNA composition.
Hmm.
They are still Germanic speaking and still so much part of this culture that it's not really changed very dramatically, but at least there is some kind of shift in the basic composition of DNA. Uh, the problem is that we don't have so many graves with preserved skeletons from the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries because they were cremated or
Hmm.
they were not buried in any way that we're able to find them. So it's hard to map what's going on genetically in this period. And of course, we're just on the backdrop of the migration period. So it could be very interesting if we could know a bit more. But yeah, that's where
Hmm.
we are.
And as you said, and
So I,
to
yeah.
know if that's actually somebody coming back, if there's some ebb and flow between two competing groups, perhaps that we don't wouldn't know about from written.
Yeah, the interpretation in the latest study was that there might be someone coming in that had been in the Frisian area, but
Huh.
I think that every time a new study will come, they will show something different. I think
Okay.
we're still so early in the process, so I'm not sure how much we should make of
Hmm.
any particular areas, but I think it would be natural for some kind of movement outward that had been happening in the migration period, and there might be someone returning because other things are happening. We
Hmm.
also have, and this is just my thinking, so I don't know yet, but we have Christianity becoming dominant in continental Europe and England. And maybe someone who didn't want to be a part of that chose to return to the Scandinavian homelands or something like that. We
Hmm.
do see a kind of blossoming up of some of these pre-Christian practices at the same time as the Franks are becoming Christians. So,
Hmm.
so there might be something related to that.
Let me just interrupt this video for a minute to tell you about my friends and partners at Grimfrost.com. These guys have been in the business for a really long time, and they really care about getting the history right. They even get runes right, and I've done some of the runes for some of their products. If you're interested in historically authentic Viking Age products, that is the place you want to go. It's also a good place to get my books, especially if you live in Europe. I also want to update you on my books, my Wanderer's Journal, a blank journal with quotes from Havamal rendered in Younger Futhark by me, as well as in my Cowboy Havamal translation, is available for pre-order and should ship in North America by mid-April. And the second enhanced edition of my Poetic Edda translation will be available by the end of this year. It includes new poems not included in the first edition and thoroughly revised older poems. Poems are already there, and a thoroughly revised introduction, and a lot more fantastic looking art.
So I wanted to look into this relationship between the place names and these central sites. And I'm just when I was I just wanted to show you actually that I realized that I've been on excavations at least three of them, and I don't know how many archaeologists have been at so many sites. I was even there when this little Odin or not Odin figurine was found in 2009 in Lyra.
Oh,
So,
that's the one
so
with the
that's
two
my claim
birds?
to fame. Yeah, yeah, the one. Yeah, I'm holding it in this picture here.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, so it was a very exciting day. Um, yeah, and we are publishing in this project where we worked with Tisø and Gudme. We are currently publishing these sites, so you will be able to find books in English about them. So these are the two books that have come out so far. Um, yeah, this is just to show you how these two disciplines work very differently, and that's why they sometimes have difficulties speaking with each other. And archaeology is moving forward very quickly. We're also using a lot of scientific methods to get more data and different sorts of data, while the linguistics, uh, we normally know what it is that we have, but we can put it into play in new ways. But we depend on the written sources for records on place names. But we both, for both types of material, we have a very limited representativity. That means that, there are large holes in our knowledge, and it's very difficult often to interpret whether it's this or that explanation. But I think we should try. The advantage of using archaeology and toponymy is that we get a local picture compared to when we look at Old Norse texts that are written, most of them in Iceland, and at a bit of a later time. Um, so we get a more contemporary and locally based knowledge from these source materials. Yeah, so this is just a little overview of these first generation sites, and I already said these things, so I don't think we should go into it that much. This is Gudme, and as you can see, Gudme is actually also next to a lake, not as big as Tisø, but um, probably there's something with the lake at this site as well. And this gold find is the largest of the hoards from Gudme, but there are so many hoards in the whole area around Gudme. So it's a very, very special area. Um, Here you can see a development in detector finds that I made for my PhD. You can see how it kind
Hmm.
of goes back and forth through the times, but it's very massive, and it also shows that Gudme was not just one settlement. It
Hmm.
was actually a very large cluster of settlements, where the central settlement was a large hall with a smaller hall next to it that might have been a sort of cult house. But there were farms spread out in the landscape around it, and they had specialized crafts and wealthy finds in all these little farms. So it's kind of a kind of proto-urbanization almost, because they're gathering these. They still have a kind of rural expression. They're still single farms, but they're just moving together in this new way of organizing within this area. So it's very exciting, and there are other sacral place names. On the other side of the lake is a place called Gudbjerg, which means the hill of the gods. And then there are some others that are more discussed and more difficult to interpret. But um, the interesting thing about the home of the gods name is that there are actually many of them uh,
Hmm.
around Scandinavia. And what does it mean that something is a home of the gods? What do they mean by this?
Right.
Um, they are not, yeah,
Right. I mean, actually, you're what it's not obvious, is it? I mean, is it
no,
where is it where they're supposed to live? Is it the home of the hall where you worship them? Is
yeah.
it just a place you want to be blessed by them? Yeah, you're right. It is not obvious at all what that means.
No, what is usually thought is that it's a place where they are thought to reside. It's the usual interpretation, and where they are worshipped. But of course, we don't really know what did they actually mean by this. And also, these places turn out very differently archaeologically. So it's not like you just find the same kind of site. It's not. There are interesting localities at many of these sites, but they're not the same. In northern Jutland, the one to the east in northern Jutland, there are some very interesting large burial sites, and the same goes for Gudhjem on Bornholm. Some very, it's like more like a almost a necropolis, um, but yeah. So we can't have some definite expectations to these place names and what we will find in the places, but we can expect that there will be something interesting. Um, that is my main point, I
Mhm.
think. Um, yeah, here we are zooming into to Bornholm that has an abundance of interesting sites. Not so many bracteads as you might expect, but there is this site, Sorte Muld, um, which is a central place that is equivalent almost to Gudme, and it's also this has the same structure with a central site, and then all these little farms that are scattered around it, or settlements scattered around it, almost in a kind of circle. So where they have these same types of activities, and also a lot of wonderful hordes. So it's wealth that is concentrated in a larger landscape.
Hmm.
Um, yeah,
I've just that's it's very interesting to see all are all of these Gulliver from just this one spot? 3,200 of them in
uh,
this 22.
yeah. So Sortemul is completely crazy in terms of Gullgubber. 3,200, yeah, from this spot particularly. I think maybe some of them are also from uh, uh, the wider area, but not, but centrally, and most of them come from this hot spot around where all the blue dots are. Those are Gullgubber finds. Yes.
And is the thought that those
So.
are offered in some way, that they're deposited deliberately in some spot?
It's such a curiosity. What what have they done? Some ideas have been that they put them on posts, but the truth is that they were actually often destroyed. Now, the ones you see here have been, unfolded because you do that to make nice pictures. But actually, they were often crumbled or folded, or they've been stabbed or cut. So they do something to them often before depositing them.
Hmm.
So I think that they have something to do with a kind of ritual that you want to do and mark by including a gold foil in it. Some of them, for example, show these kissing or embracing couples. You can see one in the middle, and they could be kind of a betrothal or marriage going on.
Hmm.
They've also been linked to the wedding between Freya and Gerd, but it could also just be humans getting, married.
Hmm.
Um, but there are one thing that's important about them is that they're making gestures, and the gestures are often marked out with the hands being very big, and they're sometimes holding their arm or, waving, or they are doing something particular. And I think that these gestures were readable to that audience. And when I say audience, it's that's the weird thing because they're not. They're the size of a small fingernail,
Hmm.
so they're so small uh, that it's, who is it actually for? Uh,
Right.
is it for, no one can really see what's going on unless they get really, really close. So who is this communication intended for?
Huh.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
very mysterious. And why are they, they are found all over Scandinavia, but most of them are from this spot right here.
Yeah. The clustering is amazing. Uh,
Yeah.
huh.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so this is a site where it's not a sensation to find one of these, but in every other place it is a sensation.
Mhm.
But here they're like, "Oh, I'm so disappointed I didn't find one today." Um, so yeah, it's a nice place. Um, it also has a spectacular view, by the way, over the
Hmm.
sea. So yeah, this is Tisø. And you can see this lake actually, how it's also a magnificent feature in the landscape locally here. And the map shows all the excavated features. So they were not all there at the same time, but those are from different periods through time, different phases of the settlement,
Hmm.
um, right on the bank. And here you can see all the spots. These are just different finds of all types that are found along the lake, and a lot of nice amulets, hammers of Thor, and these little figurines with women with armed women with horses that we call Valkyrie brooches, even though we don't really know if it's Valkyries. Um, they really began to be something we became aware of with this site. But now they're found everywhere.
This
Um,
there's an associated question in the chat. Cameron
yeah.
asked, "Is there an association between discarded personal ornaments like Thor's hammer pendants and theophoric place names?" I guess there's actually a question whether are these discarded or are they lost or are they buried with people? What's the context of these pendants?
Well, they are found in many places, so they're not particularly related with sacred places, but there are many at Tisø. And there are also these, you can see one of them is this little iron ring with many hammers in it.
Hmm.
And such amulet rings, there are some sites in Sweden. I think it's called Frösvi. I can't remember where, but where there are many of such amulet rings with these, there are iron and then different types of miniatures. So it seems that miniatures in general are something that they're very interested in and that can have some kinds of particular meaning. So it's both miniature chairs, miniature swords, miniature other types of weapons, and also, of course, the hammer. Um, in Sweden, sometimes they're found in burials in these sets of amulets. That's not as common, I think, in Denmark. Um,
I,
but they're
I,
also, yeah,
I note another question here from Bound asking, is it true that the Thor's hammer pendants were predominantly found in women's graves? Do you know of an association?
yeah. It's definitely a general association between amulets, I think, in general, and women's graves more than male graves, which is also interesting. Um, so many of the types of amulets. Um, but yes, um,
That is surprising.
it's yeah. Well, yeah.
I mean, just because it's not, I mean, I guess you can think of all kinds of reasons for it, just, uh, gendered clothing and decor choices or something like that. But it's like, it doesn't have to be that way, right? There's
Hmm.
no reason that men couldn't wear amulets as often, perhaps. How interesting.
No,
I hadn't ever heard that myself, that they were particularly associated with women's graves.
we've also tried to see in this area if there are some deliberate kind of patterns in the distributions of these finds. And actually, no. So in the place where it says Fugledegård, that's the central area in the Viking Age, and further north is the earlier site. So they move the site they begin to live in the north, and then they move south at some point. And then further south at a place called Kalmargård, and that's the workshop area where there are a lot of finds there, but it's more workshops and small pit houses. But we have amulets and these interesting finds all over the place. And the large gold ring that I showed was found in the workshop area. Um, so we don't know what kind of relation because it was just plowed out. So we don't know what it related to in this area. And that's also the area that has been excavated the least. So we still need some more knowledge about that area. Um, but there might have been a tendency for the amulets to be more concentrated a little bit around the central area, but it's not like they came from something particular. And maybe that's just because they've been plowed around,
Mhm.
so we just don't know. Um, this is a reconstruction of the way the Tissue Hall must have looked like. You might be surprised that it's white. Um, we found evidence of lime burning, and also there's this wattle and daub walls. That's what it's called, right?
Mhm.
Where they put clay on the walls and then they've actually put lime on it. So in Norway they had wooden buildings, but in Denmark the tradition of building has always been this clay walls, wattle and daub, and they actually then made it white. So it would be interesting to see a reconstruction of a hall with those kinds of walls in real life.
Hmm.
Here is an image of these are all the kind of sacrificial finds from Tisø, the ones that are interpreted as sacral deposits of weapons, but also other types of objects. And you can see this distribution of the tier place names on the little map.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so we already talked about this. This is the area where we have the central site. So, what's special about these second generation sites is that they're actually very similar to each other. They have the same structure of a hall with a little adjacent house, and this little house is fenced in, and they are surrounded by fences. But it's like they had the same architect that traveled around and helped them, or was the main builder of all of them, or they had a similar idea about how to make these places,
Hmm.
or what is it that makes them so similar? Um, that's one of the questions I think we have to address more directly. Yeah,
Sorry,
it's okay.
I think it's done now.
Yeah. So here in the middle we have, of course, Lyra that I talked about before, but there are several places. Coming up. Just 10 years ago, 15 maybe, it was thought that these places were only in the east and not in Jutland because they had a different kind of social structure in Jutland. But then they started emerging in Jutland as well. So they also had social hierarchies in Jutland, apparently.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so the one of the new sites is Hareby. Some of you might have heard about a treasure hoard called the Fested Hoard with a lot of interesting gold objects that were excavated by Lars Grunwald from the Museum of Sønderskov, as it's called. But when they started excavating in that area, they found one of these sites as well. It's hard to see, but there is a fenced area and a hole, and then some fences around it. And the red area in the ditches is actually a stone heap.
Hmm.
Um, and stone heaps were found perhaps at Tisø, but a very marked feature of Leira, these heaps of burned and brittle stones, very, very large heaps. And then it also came here. And this place is called Hareby, which actually means hag or hawk settlement. So to me, it points towards this place being named for this feature. But
Hmm.
of course, then Elderhide is discussing this. Um, yeah, you can see there's a hammer of Thor here as well. And here is they're excavating the stone heap at this in this picture. Yeah. Um, so some main points is that it's very hard to make these links if you want to be very skeptical, but I think they are there. But it's we have to look into long time chronologies of places because a name could be there before maybe a place was founded, or the name could come after they had been starting some particular practices at a place. Um, so what's interesting about place names is that they come out of people talking to each other and describing places and agreeing on something particular about a place. So they will reflect a kind of agreed upon interpretation of a place.
Hmm.
Um, and I think also that as soon as a place is called home of the gods, that will have an effect on the way that people perceive the place moving forward, right? So we have to think of it as processes all the time. Yes, there are plenty of books to read if you're interested in looking into this more. These are some of the publications from these later decades. So whereas religion was something that archaeologists stayed away from for a long time, it's become more normal and accepted to work with these problematics, luckily. Um, yeah.
I really like what the phrase you used there, place biographies. right? The place
Yeah.
we're not talking about a place that was inhabited for a year. We're looking at places that were inhabited for centuries, and the
Hmm.
name is right. It's part of it's somewhere in the continuum of time. It may not be the original name, but at some point it was agreed, like you said, among people. For some reason, this name made sense to people because of
Hmm.
some characteristic, right? That's a very I really like that point and that
Yeah.
term as biography.
Yeah, also because of each place is developing in its own way. So when we try to look for patterns, that's when we become disappointed or surprised, because then it will turn out differently. And that's of course because people in different regions still they would have had different local ways of doing things. Traditions would differ a little bit between even between families or there would be all these differences, and then still we have a lot of similarities across Scandinavia. So that's some of the fascinating um, aspects of looking at Scandinavia throughout, even also the Bronze Age, is that it has this kind of unified culture throughout the millennia, but still they also have these little differentialities um, in, for example, which gods they worship or the way they shape uh, a cult site or pots or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah.
Well, for instance, there must be something to the fact that Tyr occurs all over the Danish landscape and nowhere in the Icelandic landscape. There's something to that. What that reflects is hard to say. I'd be interested. Do you, one thing you notice a lot in looking at Icelandic place names and medieval Greenlandic place names is there's tons of personal names, right? It's
Hmm.
Eiríksstaðir or
Yeah.
Haukstallur, or
Hmm.
it's all these places guys named it after themselves. And my impression, and I'm curious if this is true, is that on the continent you don't see as many personal names and place names, or is there a layer at which you see a lot of personal names?
Um, on the continent, as in Scandinavia, or in
Scandinavian.
the yeah.
Sorry, Denmark,
Well,
Norway, Sweden.
yeah, because the phenomenon is also there in Germany and England, but
Mhm.
and both for the earlier Germanic types of names, but also then Viking names. So the Vikings that settled in England also used a lot of personal names
Mhm.
for thorps and thwaites and what they are called in England.
Wow.
Um, but yeah, so personal names and place names is actually quite fascinating because when it starts in Scandinavia, it's probably a bit early, and it happens with these Leo names that we discussed in the beginning with
Mhm.
Vineleo and some of these Leo names have they're combined with terms that could be personal names, but could also be a sort of by name or title because they seem to be functions. So there's it's sometimes difficult to see when a a title stops and a name begins
Uh,
at this point. But they actually already begin in the well, the maybe the fourth century actually, but that's very early. And then this is the type of name that comes in and has something to do with land rights and land ownership. But the main type of name that you get with personal names in Scandinavia is Thorpe, and that
okay.
happens in the Viking Age when a, great settlement expansion is happening all over the place, and they break out of larger, older villages and make their own new little villages or settlements, farms, and they give it their own name. So you get Thorpe and stuff like that. And this is a process that happens at the same time as the settlement of Iceland and England. So it's a kind of the same thing going on at home as abroad.
Interesting that you can
Yeah.
trace these two particular movements, the settlement of new farms, the settlement of new lands. You can actually see something happening in the way that places are named in association with something that's happening in the culture that way. Uh, that's cool. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily expect that that would change because, uh, just as easily it seems like a fashion, right? The fashion could be,
Hmm.
I'm going to name this after my favorite god, or I'm going to name this after something notable about the landscape. This is Big Tree Farm or whatever,
Yeah.
right? But
Well,
it's
it's
interesting.
clearly, yeah, a fashion that in some areas they seem to grow fond of some type of element or some way of making a place name, and when you have some, there will be more of the same type. So that's
Yeah,
why they sometimes cluster in some areas. Um, and I also think that these two groups of names with personal names, they probably represent some different ways of structuring the landscape, where the Leo names are a bit more mysterious and also represent a kind of shift in the way landscape is interpreted. Because before that, most names were actually just describing the landscape. Like there was like a hill or a tree, and then there would be these sacred words, but there was nothing actually related to individuals. If you suddenly interpret a place as related to a particular individual, uh, it's a very it's a shift in the way you understand the landscape, I think.
right. And just fascinating to trace that through names and through the archaeology associated with the place too. Uh, oh, this has been a really fascinating talk, and I've really appreciated you giving us all of your time and especially showing us these slides. We can get a sense of the landscape and some of the finds there. I was kind of astonished by all of the cool cover. I didn't know there were thousands of them from that one site in Bornholm. That's amazing.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a very fascinating place.
are there
Um,
remaining questions in the chat?
I'm just checking here.
I see a bunch of thank yous.
Yeah.
Or any other points you'd like to make in closing? Because you made some
No,
great ones.
not not if there are no more questions. Uh, but I appreciate being here. It's fun and it's nice to talk about these insights into the landscape. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you also for the follow-up, the mentioning the articles and the books for people to follow up with. That's great material.
Yeah, great.
So thank you much, and we'll hope to have you back before long.
Okay, we can find something else very fascinating to talk about. Gullgubbar, for example.
I was about to say I have a notion of some topics here. Yeah, Gulliver would be great.
Yeah,
Let's talk
good.
about it.
Okay.
Well, thank
Yeah,
you very
have a
much,
good
and
day. Yes.
you too. All right, all the
Bye.
best, everybody.